Resuming debate. Well, we're going to resuming debate. I'll just let the honourable member for Nunavut know that we're about 5 minutes remaining in the time for the business of supply this afternoon. So we'll go to her now. The honourable member for Nunavut.
Matna, Mr. Speaker. For much of Canada, the 215 children in Kamloops residential school grounds was a shocking discovery. But for Indigenous peoples, this was not a discovery, this was a confirmation of the reality of genocide that we have known all along. I'm glad to hear members finally waking up to what Indigenous peoples already knew, but many in this chamber clearly have more to discover about the reality of ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples across Canada. I see this every day in my riding, and I need my colleagues, Canadians, and the world to listen. Recently, I spoke with a friend of mine, Nikki Komotsiutiksak. Nikki is originally from Nunavut, but moved to Winnipeg at a very young age with her mother to live with her aunt. Both her mom and her aunt are residential school survivors. After arriving to her new home, Nikki experienced severe amounts of abuse. Eventually, she ran away from home to escape violence, but police found her and brought her back to her house. They thought her resistance to going home was because she was a defiant kid, so they pushed her to the front door. Nikki was so terrified of what was on the other side, she tore her clothes off to show the police her injuries. They stared at Nikki, a 13-year-old with hundreds of whip marks and stab marks all over her body. The police brought her to the hospital where she stayed for 24 hours, and immediately afterwards she was brought to her first group home. She felt incredibly alone. Nikki was never asked what she wanted or how she felt or how she needed help. Because of this, she felt it was better to run away to be with her friends, but again, caught by the police and put back into the system. In just 2 years, Nikki was in 15 group homes, always running away, trying to find a sense of normalcy and feeling more and more alone. She went into foster care with her cousin, who was so close with her they considered one another sisters. Her cousin was murdered in Winnipeg at the age of 17 years old, and still no one has taken responsibility for her death. Imagine, even before you've graduated high school, to be tossed from home to home, not often shown love in a way a child needs it, and not having stability or consistency in day-to-day life. Nikki attempted to die by suicide many times and eventually was put into a treatment center. There she received counseling and therapy for the first time ever. She started to learn new ways of coping and was given tools to start working towards breaking cycles of trauma. From therapy, she was eventually put into a foster home with parents that cared and loved her. While in the foster system, Nikki had 3 babies of her own and fought to make sure they were never ever taken away from her. This wasn't easy, but she fought and won. She eventually finished grade 12, went to university, and got an amazing job where she fights to support Inuit every day at Dungasugit. She now fosters high-risk teenage girls herself. The story of Nikki is a story of thousands of Inuit and Indigenous children across Canada. Nikki's strength and resilience means her children have a bright future. That strength came with herself and her will to become better. Colonization is not over. It has a new name. Children are still being separated from their communities. Foster care is the new residential school system. The suicide epidemic is the new form of Indigenous genocide. I come from a community with one of the highest rates of suicide. Throughout my life, I've seen periods of extreme hopelessness in Baker Lake, where there are sometimes 3 or 4 suicides in less than 2 months. These were my friends, teammates, and classmates. I often wondered growing up if things are changing or are just getting worse. But the intergenerational trauma of the recent past has created a terrible cycle where death has become normal. For Inuit, suicide is an epidemic. We know in Nunavut that things often aren't recorded or investigated correctly. Many families don't get answers. Questionable information is withheld. Questions go unanswered and ignored. Families don't have support in any way, shape, or form. Often families are left to clean the remains of their loved one. I've heard stories of people with no heads, of the colors they turn when they hang themselves from the ceiling, and the way it smells when someone passes away. There's often times when children and youth see much of this. And after all of these traumatic incidents, there aren't many mental health resources, let alone culturally relevant mental health resources available to these children and these families. Just like suicide and death, losing children to foster care is becoming the norm for Inuit families. This is a direct outcome of basic rights being violated.
I regret to interrupt the honourable member. I regret to interrupt the honourable member. We are unfortunately at the expiry of time for the business of supply for today. Yes.
I believe if you seek it, you'll find unanimous consent to allow the member to finish her speech, Mr. Speaker.
I'm seeing great accord with that suggestion. So let me go back to the honourable member for Nunavut. The honourable member has an additional 4.5 minutes if we allow the usual time for her remarks, and I thank all honourable members. The honourable member for Nunavut.
Matna, Mr. Speaker, thank you for letting me continue. Just like suicide and death, losing their children to foster care is becoming the norm for Inuit families. This is a direct outcome of basic human rights being violated. Put that on top of injustices from history. Before the 1950s, Inuit lived the way we have lived for thousands of years. No housing crisis, no suicide epidemic. Then the Canadian government increased its presence in the north, not to support Inuit, but because Canada wanted to develop natural resources and, most importantly, demonstrate its sovereignty in the region. They wanted the land, they did not care for the people in it. And what happened? Inuit were forced into settlements and lived in what they called matchbox houses. Clearly, from this time onward, Inuit have never had adequate or safe housing. Inuit sled dogs, or qimmiit, were slaughtered by the RCMP as a means to keep Inuit in the settlements and prevent them from traditional hunting to feed themselves. This meant that Inuit were forced to rely on the government, much like we still continue to see today. Inuit were ripped from the settlements and sent on boats to southern Canada to be treated for tuberculosis. Often there were helicopters that scouted the area to take away Inuit that were in hiding and didn't want to go. At hospitals and sanatoriums in the south, there were a wide variety of things that happened. Inuit were forbidden from speaking Inuktitut. They were beaten, sexually assaulted, belittled, and many children never made it home. We also hear about experiments being done on people in these sanatoriums. Along with these, Canada had residential schools in the north. Inuit children were forced to go to church-sponsored schools for months or years at a time to assimilate them. Their hair was cut and their clothes were changed, and they were forced to do hard labor. Their language was beaten out of them often. Of course, people today are stressed, depressed, and anxious. This is not ancient history. Children who went through this horror now have children my age. We are barely surviving. Privileged Inuit like myself are those who aren't fighting for basic human rights every single day and see how unfair this all is. And we stand up for other Inuit. This is why I am here. I'm here in an institution that has tried to eliminate my people for the last 70 years, standing up to say that the federal government is responsible for the ongoing colonization happening. The residential schools and genocide waged against us has evolved into the foster care system and the suicide epidemic we see today. Residential schools and Indigenous genocide is a 21st century problem. Acting is in the hands of this government. They can choose to support efforts toward real change, like the motion we propose today, or they can join governments of the past in perpetuating violence against Indigenous peoples. Do not tell me you cannot afford to honor the promises made during colonization about housing. Provide all Nunavummiut with decent homes. Canadian billionaires added $78 billion to their wealth in just the last year, and we are not taxing them. This is about priorities. Do not tell me you cannot afford to provide safe space for Inuit. The inaction of successive Liberal and Conservative governments is a direct reason for Nunavut's deaths, violence, and turmoil. I demand that this government treat us like human beings, fulfill your promises, and give us basic human rights. Matna, Mr. Speaker.